Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Faraday Institute seminar today. You're all very welcome, both here in person and for you watching online, wherever you are, you're very welcome indeed. So today we are especially glad to welcome as our speaker, all the way from Washington, DC in the United States, Professor Brandon Vaidyanathan, who's also an associate of the Faraday Institute here, but he is currently professor and chair of the Department of Sociology in the Catholic University of America in Washington, DC. He holds a doctorate in sociology from the University of Notre Dame, and his research examines the cultural dimensions of religious, commercial, medical, and scientific institutions, and he's been widely published in peer-reviewed journals. He's currently doing research on the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on faith communities and on scientists. But his research that forms the background of today's talk has focused on the role of aesthetics in scientific practice and institutions. And that forms the background to our seminar today, some research that's been conducted in association with Ruth Bankovich here at the Faraday and funded through the Faraday Institute. So we want to welcome Dr. Vaidyanathan, and he's going to speak to us on a beautiful quest, the promise and peril of aesthetics in science. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone. I'm very grateful to the Faraday Institute. Hello to everybody watching online, and thank you again for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be able to share this work, which is, I should warn you, in its very early stages. So you're the first batch of guinea pigs with whom I'm testing out some of these results, and I really look forward to your ideas, to your questions, and to a stimulating discussion. So let me share my slides, and hopefully this should work. I hope you can see this. So as Paul mentioned, this the talk is titled "A Beautiful Quest: The Promise and Peril of Aesthetics in Science," and this is a project that is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust. So I want to express my gratitude to them as well for expressing interest in this work and sponsoring this project. So to get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about the roadmap for what lies ahead. I'll start by giving you a bit of background about the study, the sort of motivations that inspired it, and say a little bit about the methodology. And then really the bulk of the talk is going to focus on two parts. The first is looking at the data on beauty in science. And the second is, since this is a talk at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, we'll look a little bit at the relationship between religion and spirituality among scientists and their aesthetic experiences. And after that, we can open up for some discussion. So to get started, when we think of science, we typically think of words like rational and systematic, methodical, analytical, calculating. The image of a scientist really is sort of often there are some studies done about this, right? As it's typically a white male in a lab coat who's very socially awkward. Rarely do we think of science as beautiful and of scientists as sort of passionate in the sense in which we might think of, say, artists. And this is a long-standing critique, right? You think about someone like Keats, who complained that Newton had destroyed all the poetry of the rainbow by reducing it to the prismatic colors, and complained that natural philosophy or science had really reduced the mysteries of the natural world, right? Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy? Philosophy or science will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and nomad mind, unweave a rainbow, and so on. And in recent years, a number of scientists, such as Richard Dawkins, who you're all probably very familiar with, have pushed back against this sort of caricature and have noted, for instance, that the feeling of awed wonder that science can give us is one of the highest experiences of which the human psyche is capable. It's a deep aesthetic passion to rank with the finest that music and poetry can deliver. It is truly one of the things that make life worth living, very much at odds with the public perception of scientists. I want to you can hear this, but Richard Feynman gives another really great example of his problem with this caricature of scientists. Right. So the question then for me is this sort of aesthetic recognition that you see in someone like Dawkins or Feynman universal, right? Is this recognition of the beauty and awe and wonder of science the prerogative of geniuses and celebrity scientists and Nobel Prize winners, or does it apply equally to the ordinary practice of science? Right. So how do scientists understand beauty and awe and wonder? How do they experience these aesthetic dimensions in their work? How do such experiences shape the practice of science? How important do scientists consider these experiences? And what implications do these aesthetic experiences have for things like well-being and motivation and retention in scientific careers? So these are the questions that really struck me as I came across the work of folks like Dawkins and Feynman, but also in some previous research that I was doing, where we heard a number of scientists in our conversations with them talk about why beauty was important to them. And so I wanted to systematically examine to what extent we can see the prevalence of beauty and awe and wonder in the work of scientists. And so the methodology of the study really, we conducted research in 4 countries. Now some of you may be familiar with Elaine Howard Eklund's Rosig study, Religion Among Scientists in International Context, that was published in the book Secularity and Science. This is sort of a follow-up study to that project. It was in that project actually that we came across some scientists talking about the importance of beauty in their work. And so we decided to focus on 4 countries from that initial study because I had a number of research contacts in these countries, and they were sufficiently distinct and had different, interesting distinctions and variations in terms of science infrastructure and the kind of culture around aesthetics that I thought it would be interesting to examine them in more depth. And in these countries, we focused on scientists in physics and biology departments at PhD granting universities and research institutes. Now, I can say more in detail about why we use this, but we needed a sampling frame from which to take nationally representative samples. And so we needed some way to access a list of scientists from which we could draw such a sample. And this was the most feasible way to construct such a list and then generalize to this population. So then we conducted surveys in these 4 countries, and we contacted some 22,000 scientists, and nearly 3,500 of them completed the survey. That gave us about a 15% response rate. And then we conducted in-depth interviews with 215 of these scientists. So I can come back during the Q&A if you'd like more details on our methodology to say a bit more about what we did and how we did it and why and so forth. Here's the sample that we essentially got from the survey. Right, so we have scientists in these 4 countries, the US, the UK, India, and Italy. And the benefit of doing these representative samples is that we can weight it. Since we have the population from which we sampled, we're actually able to weight the statistics, and that allows us to make generalizations that overcome some of the problems with non-response bias. As you can see, we have fairly decent distribution of gender, and given that there are far fewer women in physics than in biology, this is a pretty good sample. We had sampled scientists based on departments, and so we do have a number of scientists who are in what we would consider physics and biology departments who are not officially physicists or biologists, right? So you would have scientists who have degrees in chemistry or computer science and so on. And we sampled scientists across their career stages, starting from postgraduate students all the way through to senior faculty. So I want to focus on the first part of our results and talk about what we found regarding beauty in science. And so the first thing to look at is, what do scientists mean by beauty? And here we find some interesting distinctions between physicists and biologists. And we find that now these categories, we have symmetry, asymmetry, elegance, a sense of fit, hidden order or patterns, the inner logic of systems, harmony, pleasing colors or shapes, complexity and simplicity. These categories emerged from a combination of looking at the literature, the past literature on beauty in science, as well as a number of pilot interviews that we conducted, both as part of the previous study with Eklund, as well as a follow-up study just focused on trying to understand what scientists mean by beauty. So we generated these categories and then are now able to assess how prevalent these are among scientists. And the interesting thing we find is for physicists, there's much more propensity to associate beauty with symmetry and simplicity compared to biologists, whereas for biologists, beauty tends to be more associated with complexity and pleasing colors or shapes. But what they have in common is finding beauty in hidden order or patterns, the inner logic of systems, and also to some degree in elegance. And I'll come back to this and say a bit more, but it's interesting to see that there's some important disciplinary variation in what beauty means. Besides looking at what beauty means, we looked at how frequently scientists experience beauty in their work. And so we see at least a few times a year, most scientists experience a sense of clarity as they see how things fit together, a sense of surprise in discovering a hidden order or deeper systems underlying the phenomena they're researching, feeling pleased by the elegance of a scientific object, and a little bit less frequently feeling pleased by encountering symmetry in equations or models or data. And besides beauty, we also looked at wonder, and this we measured by asking scientists how frequently they felt grateful for learning something new. And again, we see this is much more common for most scientists to encounter this sense of gratitude, a sense of childlike delight or joy during their work, a feeling that their research opened up new mysteries for them to explore, just like what Feynman was talking about, right? So it's a very frequent experience for most scientists. Thinking about a scientific problem keeping you up at night, right? So the sense of wonder, the sense of insatiable curiosity, wanting to know, is very common for scientists. And then finally, awe, which may be less frequent, relatively less frequent, but no less important. So even there are scientists who tell us that they've had one or two experiences of, say, feeling their sense of self becoming smaller in the face of what they were researching, or feeling like they were in the presence of something grand. But that doesn't mean that those infrequent experiences are unimportant. Right, so these are, again, experiences that characterize the practice of science. And so these questions are about the beauty and awe and wonder that scientists experience in their work. So looking at beauty in particular, it seems to us that there are three distinct types of beauty. The first is what we'd call simple beauty. So that's things like sensory experiences or pretty colors or pretty shapes or pretty equations. The second is what we'd call useful beauty. So that's beauty as a heuristic for truth. And the third is the beauty of understanding. I don't know if these are the best ways to talk about these things. So if you have other suggestions for what these categories are, they'd be most welcome, but I'll tell you a little bit about each of these types so that you have a sense of what we're talking about. The first kind of beauty is perhaps the most common, and this is what scientists mean when they say they encounter beauty in the phenomena they study, right? In stars or in plants or in animals and galaxies and light, so they, in slides, all sorts of things, they encounter beauty on a regular basis. One biologist gives us this example. She says, I personally think that a pollinator visiting a flower, both of those things to me are incredibly beautiful, and the two of them interacting with each other, I think, is one of the most beautiful things in nature, which is why I study pollination, right? So it's also a motivation, as I'll say in a little bit. But this is one kind of beauty. The second kind of beauty is beauty as a heuristic. And here, typically, scientists are talking about symmetry and simplicity and elegance and naturalness in their scientific models, in their scientific equations, and so on. We find that there's a lot of discussion on this that tends to be concentrated in theoretical physics. So one example, Roger Penrose talks about Maxwell's equations, and many scientists gave Maxwell's equations as being the sort of first quintessential example of beauty in their work, particularly in scientific theories. And Penrose says it would seem that the symmetry of these equations and the aesthetic appeal that this symmetry generated must have played an important role for Maxwell in his completion of these equations, right? So it is that intuition of beauty or the experience of beauty as a guide to truth. So many examples of scientists who've talked about this. Poincaré talks about this feeling of mathematical beauty and the harmony of numbers and forms of geometric elegance helps scientists to identify useful patterns. The controversial quote by Dirac, who says it's more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. And Gell-Mann talking about how in fundamental physics, a beautiful or elegant theory is more likely to be correct than a theory that is inelegant. So how does this work? The philosopher James McAllister has this concept called aesthetic induction. And basically he says that scientists at time t attach aesthetic value to a property p, roughly in proportion to the degree of empirical success scored up to t by all theories that exhibit p, right? So there's a track record that particular aesthetic properties can accrue. And aesthetic preferences are linked to those theories' empirical successes, and then are believed to be attuned to true theories. Now, radically new theories are initially seen as aesthetically displeasing, right? So you think about Kepler and astronomers around that time who realized that the sphere, which they thought was the most perfect shape, didn't actually correspond to what the data were showing them about the shape of the orbits of planets. That was sort of an obstruction for a while, but then their perceptions become favorable as the empirical performance of those theories improves. And so then you realize, well, the ellipse is not really all that ugly, and you develop a new aesthetic sensibility. So McAllister says that aesthetic induction assures the link between aesthetic judgments and past empirical performance, right? And this is a pervasive tendency. It is involuntary. A scientific community necessarily develops this sort of taste. And to be overcome, it requires scientists to believe, firstly, that established aesthetic preferences impede the adoption of better theories in terms of potential empirical performance. And secondly, there's no separate justification for these preferences. This is sort of happening now in theoretical physics, as I'll say in just a moment. But for McAllister, this is essentially what underlies the scientific revolution. Some of you might be familiar with Thomas Kuhn's work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. McAllister argues that there's an aesthetic component to scientific revolutions, that when you have a shift from one paradigm to another, it requires a leap in aesthetic judgments. And the aesthetics of a particular community, aesthetic tastes and sensibilities of a particular scientific community can be an impediment to that sort of paradigm shift. So the critique then is that, look, in the past, many beautiful theories were considered wrong, and then ugly ones turned out to be right and no longer considered ugly. And so presently in theoretical physics, there are folks like Jim Baggett who argue that theories of supersymmetry and superstrings, the multiverse and so on, are driven largely by beautiful mathematics and are not only not true, they're not even science. They're fairy tale physics, right? So this stuff is not even wrong. We don't even know what this is. These theories are not in principle empirically testable. Beautiful math is not really a good guide to truth. And again, a very vocal critic of this reliance on beauty is Sabine Hassenfelder, whose book, Lost in Math, argues that aesthetic judgments have flourished in scientific research programs. And again, focus tends to be mainly in theoretical physics here, theories of supersymmetry, the multiverse, grand unification, and so on, that now occupy thousands of scientists. And in these 40 years, society spent billions of dollars on experiments that found no evidence to support the beautiful ideas. And when physics tries to rectify a perceived lack of beauty, such as complaining that the standard model is ugly, we waste time on problems that aren't really problems, right? So the critique is that, look, beauty is, maybe it was a reliable guide for the first half of the 20th century, but that sort of aesthetic is no longer working, right? So that's the kind of critique that's emerged in the last few years. One of the things we've done in our study is we wanted to just assess the extent to which scientists share either the view of aesthetics as a heuristic, of beauty as a heuristic, or the critique that has been offered by folks like Baggett and Hassenfelder and so on. And so we gave them these sorts of questions. A beautiful or elegant theory is more likely to be correct than a theory that is inelegant. We find that more scientists disagree than agree with this particular statement. Similarly, we asked scientists whether mathematical beauty is a good indicator of scientific truth. Here, again, we find a little bit more disagreement than agreement. And then Dirac's famous quotation is more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. We only asked this of physicists because biologists we ran this by in just our conversations thought it was such an absurd statement that it would undermine the seriousness of our survey to include it. But we asked this of physicists, and the vast majority of physicists disagree with Dirac here. Only 9% agree with the statement, 70% disagree. So we're able to intervene in some of these debates around beauty as a heuristic. So what are the implications of this work? So most scientists seem to recognize beauty as important, but not in the way that many scholars have emphasized until now. The conversation has really been focused on beauty too. And critics of the role of beauty in scientific work tend to focus on the potential problems of aesthetic criteria to the neglect of the larger and more integral role of aesthetics in science, which brings me to beauty 3, which we think is really the heart of of not just aesthetics in science, but of scientific work itself. One of our interviewees, a Nobel laureate in biology, gave us a really beautiful quotation for what this kind of beauty is about. He says it's recognizing that this is what's going on. That's what I mean. This is the kind of thing. There's a leap to the truth, or a leap to a sense of generalization, or something that is beyond the particular, but in some way represents the real thing that's there, the real thing that's going on. So you see that in science, and that's the recognition. So I think we think of that as beautiful. We have a number of scientists who say beauty is, yeah, sure, there's pretty colors and pretty shapes and pretty equations, and sure, there's beauty as a heuristic, but there's something else, there's something deeper going on, which is when we recognize how reality works, when we get insight into what's really going on, when things come together. Another physicist in Italy talked about this as the beauty of having understood something of the world. An American biologist told us the beauty is that when we all sit together, we learn something from each other, we spread this education or knowledge, what we have to teach each other, and finally, at the end of the day, we come out of the room with something new, right? So it's the insight and you can generate these insights by looking under a microscope or by looking into a telescope, or through conversation with other scientists, through the peer review process, or through the way in which you discuss things, or even teach or mentor. That is part of the scientific process through which this sort of beauty emerges. And so most scientists, again, we're going back to some of our data, 86% of scientists report here they were thrilled by a new insight at least a few times a year. 83% felt their research opened up new mysteries to explore a few times a year. 61% felt a sense of reverence or respect about what they were discovering. Again, this is what we think is relevant to beauty 3. 60% ascribe beauty to the hidden order or patterns and to the inner logic of systems. 57% say encountering beauty improves scientific understanding. 54% encounter beauty in teaching science. And we think it's a big part of teaching. And when we interview them and ask them what they find beautiful about teaching, it is that experience of seeing others experience the same insights that they had experienced, right? It's seeing other people experience the same beauty of discovering something, of learning something, where there's some recognition of here's what's going on. So this is essentially the first of 3 tensions we find regarding beauty and science, which is that on the one hand, aesthetic experiences, both those simple forms of beauty as well as beauty 3, which is beauty of understanding, these sorts of experiences are integral to the practice of science, but aesthetic criteria, that is beauty 2, while unavoidable in scientific work, are not always reliable, right? So there's a little bit of a tension here, and we think the focus has been too much on beauty 2, at least in the conversation between physicists and philosophers, and we would like to expand that conversation to think about this beauty 3. There are a couple of other tensions, and I'm not going to dwell on them in too much detail for this presentation, but I could say a little bit more if we want to come back to that in the discussion. So the second tension that we see is that aesthetic factors motivate scientists to pursue and persevere in scientific careers, but rather than harnessing this drive, scientific institutions generate pressures that deplete these sorts of aesthetic factors. And so as motivation, 62% of scientists state that encountering beauty in their scientific work motivated them to pursue scientific careers. 50% say that encountering beauty in their scientific work helps them persevere when they experience difficulties or failure in their work. We also find in our regressions that aesthetic experiences associated with job satisfaction and mental health and well-being, net of various controls. So it seems to matter quite a bit for well-being in science. And yet there are tremendous institutional pressures that mitigate the sort of effects of beauty and even the ability to experience beauty in science. So the publish or perish culture, the increased over-specialization, the funding constraints, job market, mistreatment, and so on. We have a number of examples. I'll just give you a couple of quotations just to give you a sense of the toll of these institutional pressures. We have one physicist in the UK talk to us about how, look, I don't think you enter academia unless you've had that sense of beauty, at least at one point in your life, just because it's so difficult. I mean, it's a bit of a rat race the whole time to keep up with, the whole time you have to be struck by the beauty of all of it, either the process of science or just the universe in its entirety or whatever. I think you'd have to be, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. Why would you do all this, right? So there's what makes it worthwhile to persevere in spite of all these pressures is the beauty you experience in your work. But not for everyone. It's not really a reliable fuel. So we talked to a number of scientists who also left academia, and many of them complained, look, we're killing the creativity in graduate students and postdocs, 20 to 30-year-olds. The publisher pressure system tells people you don't have to be creative, you just have to be productive. And another biologist in the US says there's a constant fear of, if you don't do this, if you don't hit these metrics, you're not going to be able to do what you love to do anymore. A third tension is that scientists see aesthetics as integral to communicating science, to sharing science with each other, but they're very skeptical of its value for improving public trust in science. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about this in this presentation, but I'll give you just a little bit of insight into what this means, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this later on in the discussion if this is of interest. But what's going on here is this, right? So scientists, on the one hand, really want the public to share the beauty of science. 62% of scientists state that encountering beauty in their scientific work motivates them to share the beauty of science through teaching or mentoring. 49% state that encountering beauty in their scientific work motivates them to communicate science to the public. And one scientist, a physicist in the US, says, I do find it valuable to learn things just for my own understanding and sort of like pleasure in that sense. But I really think the most valuable part is how we can tell other people about what we've learned, right? That's pleasurable as well as valuable. There's beauty in, again, not just teaching science to others, but also sharing it with the public. But one of the things we ask scientists is, do they think that sharing the beauty of science can help overcome the public mistrust in science? And most of them told us no. They said, look, because science is about discovery and because scientists appreciate that knowledge is provisional, a lot of times things that we learn about in science are in conflict with ideas that people hold in their hearts very strongly. And so I think that people a lot of times distrust that in science. We heard this refrain over and over again. When we asked the question as to, do you think sharing the beauty of science with the public can help improve trust in science or trust in scientists? Many scientists told us, you're being really naive here. They exhibited a sort of Hobbesian pessimism. And this goes back to this debate between Hobbes and Boyle some 350 years ago, which is documented very beautifully in Chapin and Schaeffer's book, The Leviathan, the Air Pump. So you had on one hand, Boyle, who had developed the experimental method and was really thrilled at the prospects that, look, we've got a way to have consensus about truth. We can have a bunch of people come into my chambers here and you can watch this experiment and see how it's performed, and then we can agree that this is really what happened, and then we can establish these facts. And Hobbes was much older at the time, sort of scoffed at him and said, you must be silly to think that a bunch of elites hanging out in some back room coming up with some observations are going to convince people of anything. The people are going to, even two people looking at the same set of facts are going to interpret them based on whether or not those observations support their political priors. They will interpret so-called facts based on whether or not it agrees or disagrees with their interests and their commitments. And scientists today seem to be very much echoing Hobbes's view here that people's political interests and priors will filter any science that is communicated to them. So forget about communicating the beauty of science and trying to overcome the skepticism or mistrust of scientists. That's not really going to work. Now, we think there's something else that we should learn here, right? So maybe the value of aesthetics may not be primarily for improving public trust in scientists or even in science understood as facts, right? So that may not be the most important thing. Rather, what we could learn is how to cultivate a more adequately scientific posture towards the world. And this is where we think Beauty 3 is really important, that taste for the beauty of understanding. In Daniel Kahneman's words, there's even something like the joy of having been wrong, right? So experiencing a sense of pleasure in realizing, gosh, I thought I would find this and I found something else, and isn't that amazing? So now I can learn something new, right? So there's an aesthetic pleasure that comes there. Experiencing the beauty of understanding presupposes a certain intellectual humility, we think, a willingness to be surprised, a willingness to change one's priors, and to learn with and from the collective efforts of the community of inquiry, right? And this is something that I think science is really good at doing. And wouldn't it be amazing to communicate this to the world, right? Such a scientific posture would reflect the actual intrinsic motivations of scientific inquiry, right? Seeking to constantly improve one's understanding of reality, cultivating that wonder in pursuit of Beauty 3, right? That aesthetic recognition, rather than simply reinforcing one's own opinions, learning to love truth more than one's own opinion, right? So how do you cultivate a taste for that? That for me is what I think is most interesting about what we find about beauty 3. Maybe it's naive, I don't know. Let me know what you think. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this in particular, because my sense is maybe that's one of the most important contributions or implications of our work. I want to switch gears now a little bit to talk about religion, spirituality, and aesthetics in science. And hopefully it's not, as Monty Python would say, now for something completely different. I'll try to see how these things link a little bit. So to give you a little bit about the sort of religious demographics of our sample, not surprisingly, most of our scientists are not religious, right? This is what we found in Eklund's study as well. The vast majority of scientists, particularly in these countries that we're studying, do not have any religious affiliation. But others are, you'd say, you could see sort of largely Christian and Hindu, because we've got a sizable Indian sample, Jewish, Muslim, and then a few other. Similarly, in terms of importance of religion or spirituality to scientists, for most scientists, religion or spirituality is not at all important. In what follows, I want to concentrate on this particular group, those who say that either religion or spirituality is very or moderately important to them. And in terms of religion and spirituality, we have a little bit of a breakdown on whether scientists consider themselves not religious or not spiritual, and that's the majority here. Not religious but spiritual, or spiritual but not religious. Interestingly, very low in India compared to other countries as a proportion of the whole in the country. Religious but not spiritual. So these are scientists who, when we talk to them, they say, look, I attend religious services, I'm part of a religious community, my spouse is religious, and so on. We have religious practices at home, etc. But I'm not sort of personally really invested in it. I don't know if I really believe this stuff, etc. Right? So they have some sort of religious connection, and then religious, both religious and spiritual, which is what we would think of as sort of conventionally religious scientists. So breaking this down by country, scientists for whom religion or spirituality is very or moderately important, maybe not very surprising. The smallest proportion is in the UK. The largest proportion here is in India, and there's a pretty large variation here in the US. So let's go through a few of these sort of indicators of aesthetics and see how religion or spirituality matters or is associated with these outcomes. So this first one is what's called a dispositional positive emotion scale. This is developed by Dr. Keltner and associates at Berkeley. And basically, this is what we would consider a trait scale of aesthetics. So that is, I am the kind of person who generally experiences awe and beauty and wonder and looks for patterns and has many opportunities to see the beauty of nature, etc. Right? So I'm a more aesthetically inclined person, because very clearly those who say that religion or spirituality is more important to them are significantly more aesthetically inclined than those who say religion or spirituality is not at least moderately important to them. If we break this down by those four categories of religiosity and spirituality, we see that it's spirituality here that's driving this effect, right? And which may not be entirely surprising, but we could think of things like experiencing awe or beauty or wonder itself as, well, that's what maybe spirituality means to some of these scientists. Maybe that's just their definition of spirituality. It is experiencing awe and things of that sort, right? So the lowest here is the scientists who are religious but not spiritual, not that significantly different from those who are not religious and not spiritual. So spirituality seems to be relevant to this sort of aesthetic disposition or sensibility. We then look at their experiences of awe and wonder and beauty. And here again, for awe, we see that it is scientists for whom religion or spirituality is moderately or very important, who experience awe more frequently than those for whom religion or spirituality is not important to them. There's interestingly no difference across those four types of religion and spirituality when I looked at it by that other variable. So there's something about the importance of religion that makes them more attuned to experiencing awe, it seems. Not really any significant difference in terms of wonder or in terms of beauty, right? In the frequency of encountering wonder or beauty, there's no difference between scientists, whether they're religious or spiritual or not. The other thing we wanted to look at is a measure of human flourishing. And this is a reduced version of what's called the Harvard Human Flourishing Index. And we ask, this index looks at a number of domains of well-being, like life satisfaction, physical health, mental health, sense of purpose, the extent to which people feel that things in their lives are worthwhile, virtue, acting to promote good in all circumstances, relational satisfaction, and just sort of financial security. So here we see again those for whom religion or spirituality is more important have significantly higher levels of flourishing than those for whom religion or spirituality is not important. We break it down by those 4 types of religiosity and spirituality. We see that it is really the kind of differences between those who are not religious and not spiritual compared to those who are religious and either spiritual or not, right? So there is a noticeable difference that those scientists who are not religious, not spiritual, seem to report lower levels of well-being. Maybe it's because scientists who are religious have a greater sense of purpose, or maybe they're embedded in more satisfying networks. We're not quite sure, but there is a noticeable and statistically significant difference that religiosity seems to make here. Now, we controlled for various sorts of variables here to see these effects: age, country, discipline, gender, even the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And here again, we see that there's a really significant difference, net of controls, between scientists who are either religious and not spiritual, or religious and spiritual, or not religious but spiritual, compared to those scientists who are not religious and not spiritual. That's the baseline here at 0. So significantly higher levels of flourishing for those scientists who have some level of religiosity or spirituality compared to those who are not, right? So religiosity, spirituality matter as net of other factors for human flourishing, even among scientists. We even looked at depression, and here we can see again that there is, this is a scale of psychological distress, and again, a significant difference compared to this baseline, which is scientists who are neither religious nor spiritual. Scientists who are religious, either spiritual or not, have significantly lower levels of psychological distress compared to those scientists who are not religious. So religiosity, not spirituality, but religiosity seems to really matter for psychological distress. So just to sum all that up, most scientists do seem to agree with celebrities like Dawkins and Feynman and so on in experiencing science as a source of deep aesthetic passion. But scientists who are more religious or spiritual are the ones who are most aesthetically inclined. Scientists who are more religious or spiritual experience awe, but not necessarily beauty or wonder, more frequently than scientists who are not. The positive association between religiosity and well-being, which is well established in the general population, is found among scientists as well. Scientists who are more religious or spiritual are reporting greater levels of flourishing than scientists who are neither, right? And this association holds net of controls. Scientists who are more religious also report lower levels of psychological distress than those who are not, net of controls. And again, regardless of spirituality. Maybe this is some sort of a community effect. Maybe that there's something about the, again, we did this study during a pandemic. Now we tried to control for some of the pandemic measures, but it could be that belonging to a community, whether or not you're personally invested in the spirituality of that tradition, could itself be therapeutic, at least with respect to negative mental health, right? It might really be more significant here. We don't quite know. I'd love to hear what you might think about this. And finally, aesthetics, as well as religiosity and spirituality, are independently associated with well-being outcomes. I haven't shown you that, but we have run various tests, and we see on all those well-being outcomes, whether it's job satisfaction or overall human flourishing or psychological distress, there are pathways from both aesthetics and from religiosity and spirituality that that remain independent in the same models, right? So they have independent effects, and religiosity doesn't explain away the effect of aesthetics or vice versa. Both of them seem to be independently important, even though they are associated to some degree with each other. So we still have a lot more to learn and to understand about all this. Again, like I said, this is very early stages of our analysis. We only wrapped up our data collection in January. So I would really love to hear what you think of this. what ideas you have, what questions you have, but what strikes you, what you find compelling, and any advice on where I might go next with this work. So thank you again.
Thank you very much indeed. Oops, Brandon, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating tour of your sociological research. And while we wait for a few questions to come in, perhaps I can take chairman's privilege and just raise a couple of issues that occurred to me as you were speaking there. I'm speaking as a physicist, so I was interested, of course, in some of the remarks from our physics colleagues, in particular about the beauty of mathematics. And it has always struck me that the particular example that you chose of Maxwell's equations that couples together what we experience as magnetism and electricity in a delightfully unified way, look beautiful when they're couched in SI units and using vector operators. But you write out the same equations in CGS units in Cartesian coordinates, and it covers a page of scribbly mathematics and algebra that doesn't look anything like as beautiful. So to what extent is the beauty inherent in the presentation, or in what sense is it inherent in the phenomenon itself?
Yeah, that's a really great question, right? Yeah, I think this is a source of tension. I think we've been trying to get a sense from scientists as to, is it the equation that you find beautiful or the thing that it represents? I think one of the things when they explain particularly what they find compelling about Maxwell's equations is they're usually talking about the fact that it unifies, right? The sort of unifying property that this is a single set of equations that is able to bring together fundamental forces, and similarly with the standard model, even though that's not as beautiful aesthetically, the aesthetic property that they're talking about, that sort of the property of unification, I think is really the thing. At least that's what we've heard in our interviews, that's the property that they really highlight there.
So it's the inherent symmetries that are expressed in mathematics, which may themselves be more complicated than the underlying beauty of the phenomenon itself. So just to follow that up, in what sense could you relate that sense of beauty to the spiritual nature of human beings, in the sense if we are creatures of the God who made this world and we are given some way of understanding it through our science, is there any kind of connection that you can make through our desire for beauty? Is that a reflection of our spiritual nature? And does that go back to its origin as bearing some sense of the image of God in this?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, right? And I think, for a lot of, like I said, most scientists we talk to are not religious, and we do, I've always been struck by, how strange it is that these tiny little creatures on this tiny little planet, which is kind of nowhere in the solar system, and which is also like a speck in the broader, even in our galaxy and the universe. We're kind of like really nothing. And why is it that we have the capacity to understand the workings of not just the forces that govern our planet, but of the universe itself? There's no real evolutionary benefit. It's not really obvious what the evolutionary benefit, like why? Doesn't that raise? And how I have talked to scientists is that, like, what does this awaken in you? And many of them say, I don't want to go there. so there's a sense in which it does raise a question, and you have to sort of say, well, does this mean anything about design, or does this mean anything about purpose, or why is it that we have these powers and capacities, and what is the point of it? And I think one has to do something with that question, and I think an option that many have resorted to, and is for various reasons, is to say I want to close that question. That question is in principle unanswerable. It's not a meaningful question to me, but I think the question is there. I think encountering something like Maxwell's equations, I think, confronts us with that question. I think that is part of what some theologians call the religious sense, right? That sort of intuition about why is reality understandable, and is there something beyond that we are also meant to know, or someone beyond that we're also meant to know, right? I think it necessarily raises that question, but what you do with that question is up to you.
Okay, thanks very much. I have a question in the audience here, and perhaps before I come to Pui here, and I ask a question from one of our online viewers. Roger Abbott asks a question about methodology. He asks, were the participants asked to respond as physicists, as biologists, etc., or just as participants, in other words, as neutrals? And so my question being, can we assume that all physicists, etc., think in the same way or with the same mindset or psychology? And how did you factor methodologically for scientists thinking independent of their discipline? Did you find narratives reveal any nuances of mindset or aesthetic appreciation?
Yeah, great, wonderful question. Yes, there's a lot of variation. So, I mean, and there are patterns, right? So what we report, the survey data that I'm reporting here, these are just averages. So there's certainly a lot of, variation by subdiscipline, and we do have some data on that, and it comes through very clearly in our interviews, right? So if you're a theorist versus an experimentalist, even if you're a physicist, even if you're a particle physicist, there's variation, depending on sort of, what your work actually entails. So are you working mostly, in groups with other people, or you're mostly working in your office by yourself? We didn't ask participants to respond as anything. I mean, we asked them questions about, so we didn't, well, to be clear, we didn't ask them questions about, where in your life do you experience beauty? We asked them about their work. So we don't really know much about their personal, do they spend time in museums, or, what they found beautiful in the past week. There were various questions we could have asked, and we were really constrained by, there are a lot of limitations with a study like this. We can only do a 20-minute survey, and then a 1-hour interview. So really we're constrained by those restrictions to really focus on work. So we would ask them questions about, in your work, when have you last encountered a sense of surprise, or, to what extent do you encounter beauty in scientific theories in your field, or to what extent do you encounter beauty in experiments, or tell us about the last time. So we wouldn't ask them to respond as a physicist, but I think just asking them about their work would have primed them to focus on at least their own personal experience of work. But we do find certainly variation, and in the statistics, when we do certainly regressions, we're able to control for discipline. So that is able to, at least methodologically, isolate some of those effects.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question here from our live audience here. Great.
Hi, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. This is an incredibly fascinating topic. I will frame my question in light of the project I'm working on. I'm a student of early Christianity, and I am working on a project at the moment to understand why, for some of these, especially Greek Christian writers, they were motivated to encourage fellow practitioners and Christians to study nature. And one of the interesting things I find is that, like the Greek counterparts, they were encouraged to look at nature to find this, what you call beauty-free, the real understanding in terms of how the world really works. But the real motivation in a lot of these texts seems to be that this understanding then in turn serve to structure how one pursue a good life. So that's the idea, that this understanding, this beauty-free that you're talking about, somehow for all these, a lot of these ancient writers, provides the point for the insight for a virtuous or ethical life. Now, I wonder if you can comment a little bit about, first of all, whether you think any of the participants you've talked to see this connection, and maybe the follow-up is, why do you think my hunch is that this connection doesn't quite exist as much in the present? So why do you think that is? Thank you.
Yeah, wow, that's a brilliant question. So, I mean, there is, certainly I think of, probably Aristotle's works were probably not known to the, I don't know where, I'm not sure if they were known to early Christians, right? But there is in Aristotle's work that focus on empirical study, right? You know what the good life is by studying, essentially by knowing, looking at examples of magnanimity. And if you've not encountered the magnanimous person, you will not, teaching you ethics is pointless. So there's observation is really critical, I think, for understanding virtue. And there's a sense in which I think it resonates with even St. Paul's claim to, test all things and preserve whatsoever is good and true and beautiful. And so I think there's observing how reality works, and not just nature, but also the reality of human beings. Human nature, I think, is really critical for growth in virtue, and so it sort of makes sense. And I don't recall offhand anyway any of our interviewees telling us that doing science or pursuing scientific research made them more virtuous. I do think that the beauty 3 is really linked to intellectual humility, which is really critical. You have to have certain virtues in order to do good science, and those virtues are also important to live a good life. And so, it's not even just sort of the more, like avoid the more egregious things like don't fabricate your data and so on, right? I think there's a way in which you relate to your colleagues and make sure you give credit where credit is due, and respect, students who work for you if you're a PI, and the relational virtues there that are important, but certainly the intellectual humility of not just simply willing to be wrong, but loving truth more than whatever your own opinion is, right? So really desiring to know what is true. I think that's critical for living a Christian life, is that dedication to truth and a willingness to be corrected, and I think those sorts of virtues are important. I don't recall offhand though people making that connection, obviously, but we can look through our interviews to see if we find something like that. I think it'd be interesting.
Thanks very much, Brandon. Perhaps we can time for squeezing a couple more short questions, and you can sort of give very brief answers to the first one here. Comes from Dennis Alexander. He's asking, as biological sciences can range from molecular levels to zoology and botany and the more holistic aspects of biology, can you separate your biology sample to see if this makes a difference to your data? In other words, are the molecular biologists more or less prone to see beauty in some form, or rather the zoologists perhaps see beauty in different ways?
Yeah, we're in the process of doing this. So we do have a question about their subfield. Initially, we tried to come up with categories, and then we couldn't break it down to anything less than 30 categories. And then we found that scientists were spending so much time, because we could see how long they take to answer a question, and they were spending like 7 or 8 minutes just like figuring out what is my subfield, that we decided to just create an open text box and tell us your field. Will not give you options. And so we have that data, but the challenge is now we've got to code it and figure out how to code it in meaningful ways. So we've got actually a student working on it right now. We'll see what we find, but maybe Dennis will come to you for some advice on what a meaningful set of categories might be, because it's really challenging to figure out how to parse that out. But yeah, in theory, we can do it. We have the measures. Oh, Paul, I think you're muted, or at least I can't hear you.
Sorry.
There we are.
It would be interesting to see whether that micro sample, as it were, mirrors the more general trend across the physics biology spectrum. So let's go to the next question from Peter Ackney. He says, do you think we perceive beauty and complexity, which is present in particular in biology? I mean, is there, for instance, beauty in irreducible complexity, such as a fully functioning cell? And that might imply some definition of what irreducible complexity might be, but leaving that to one side, is there beauty to be seen in something that is apparently irreducibly complex, such as a fully functioning cell?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know how it would be different from. Yeah, I have examples. The examples that come to mind are of people talking about seeing life unfolding in front of them under a microscope, right? So you see not just complexity, but how complexity works. And you're actually looking at the mechanism operate. There's a really beautiful video circulating now these days in the internet about how a T cell destroys a cancer cell. And you can actually, this scientist had captured this moment, and you could see the functioning of our immune system, and it looks very pretty, even if you don't know what it is. And once you know what it is, it's really truly awesome, right? To be able to see that. So I think that complexity is very important. It's not, it's not something you could reduce very easily to a formula or something. You have to see it unfold, and there's no easy way to represent it besides looking at it. So I don't know if that's the sort of thing that the questioner is asking, but are there various examples that biologists give? Yeah.
I remember having a similar experience when I was collaborating with some physiologists. We were looking at stem cell cultures, and these were stem cells of cardiomyocyte cells who were developed into muscle cells, particularly heart muscle cells, which spontaneously beat. And the intriguing thing was to see them on this sample spontaneously begin to beat, to oscillate, and then to come into synchronism right across, as though there was some kind of mysterious, spooky action at a distance that got them all to act in synchronism. It was really awe-inspiring. That was a beautifully complex system operating before your eyes. It really was truly wonderful. Let's go to the final question here from Kathy Peris, who asks, have you looked at what brings joy for children and young people in school science? And she asks, as a former science teacher, she would say that practicals and elegance found in scientific processes bring the most joy. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't study children in this project anyway, but one of our advisors, Mark Girard, has done a lot of work on beauty in science education. So it's one of those things I could try to pursue to see what differences or similarities there might be in the kinds of beauty that professional scientists experience compared to the kind of beauty that children experience in science. I think it would be a worthwhile avenue of inquiry, but I've not yet looked at it.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating study, because we also have a project at Faraday looking at incidents of joy in science and technology. So to link those two up would be very interesting.
Absolutely.
So let me bring our discussion to an end now, and by thanking, first of all, Professor Vaidyanathan for a really stimulating talk that's raised a lot of further interesting questions for us to go on thinking about. So thank you very much indeed for that fascinating study. Thank you too for your questions coming from the audience and from all. It's always very helpful. Further details of activities of Faraday on our website. And so once again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.